Hello everybody, my name's Ian. With this video, I'm wanting to show my process from the absolute earliest stages for doing an ink illustration. In previous videos, I've always started from, I already had the pencil illustration portion laid out, the border of the illustration laid out. All these little steps that I don't really demonstrate a whole lot. And with this one, I want to break it down as much from zero as is physically possible without just going to the store and deciding what I want to end up picking up. With this video and this particular illustration, I want to do a piece at 11 by 17, the normal size I do for comic book pages. Starting with the paper itself, I really like using this Strathmore Bristol. I've been using it for years. I've been using it somewhere in the neighborhood of 30 or so years. 11 by 17 inch, smooth surface, 100-pound weight. I find this is really nice for me for both pencil work and for ink work. For everything that I ever wanted to do, it has more than a smooth enough surface, but still has just a touch of texture to make it easy for me to work with. For me to work with pencil pieces where the pencil is the final version. It absorbs ink really well. It doesn't tend to smear. It'll show you a nice crisp line. Now, when I talk about the paper being 11 by 17, I don't actually draw at the full size. I much prefer using a standard size within that. I've already drawn that out. I had created a template for this, and actually I created it specifically for a book project I'm doing at the moment. Just grab a black ballpoint pen so that I can follow the edges and just draw this giant rectangle, centering it as best I can just by eyeballing it. And there we go. We have that interior space now. So all of the artwork I'll be doing, all the line art in this ink illustration will be within this giant rectangle I've created on this surface. This way, if I go outside that line, I know that not to worry about too much. It's not going to be live art. When I eventually scan the image, I'll be cropping it to match the outside of these lines exactly. In the last batch of videos, this sheet of paper was not sitting on the pad. I want to draw on just the paper by itself, but I don't want it to pick up the surface of the table I'm drawing on. I'm actually going to tape this down onto a board. Now behind me, I keep a couple of these boards. This is just, I don't even know what it would be, like an eighth of an inch thick wooden board. I had gone down to a hardware store, bought a large piece of board, cut out a 12 by 18 inch piece of it so that I could tape down these 11 by 17 pieces. I have a slightly smaller one back there that that I'll tape down 9 by 12 paper onto. But this works really well for me, makes it very easy for me able to move it around. It won't pick up any of the texture underneath. There's a slight paint. There's a layer of paint on top of this, preventing much in the way of texture from this board to get through into the paper. So it works really well. I had picked up this green masking tape when I picked up that board because I want the tape to be able to hold it for a while. But when I pull the tape off, it won't leave any residue. It won't tear the paper. And this tape is quite good for that. What I like to do is just put down a small piece in the corner along one side. I'll put one piece in the corner of each parts of one side of this paper, and then a longer piece that almost joins them. So the tape is holding the paper in place on the board, but the tape along the side here, when I'm working with inks, the ink itself can actually it can make the paper start to buckle and bulge a little bit. The tape on the side will prevent that and keep that to a minimum. And I'm going to do the same thing on this corner. I taped on the corner first. All of the tape and being careful to keep it outside of that box that I drew, that giant rectangle I drew. I've now prepped the board. I've now prepped the board and the paper so I can start working on it. So this desk that I'm using is, well, I'm just using an old dining room table, and it's flat. There's no angle to it at all, and this is just used for some computer monitors for two different computers that I have hooked up here. I don't want to be using an angled table. Generally, most of the work I do when I'm working on this piece will be where it's being left flat. But if I was to do the initial breakdown on this board right now, it'd be very easy for me to have the figures extend too far. They'd be too tall. They'd be too lanky because I'm looking at it at an angle for the initial composition. So I actually want to have this board sitting on an angle for my initial sketch. The way I do that is I actually have a small easel that I put on top of the desk here, and I can easily put this board onto that easel just to do my initial layout. So this is the easel that I'm using, where it has a raised part on the bottom here that will hold the paper, will hold the board and the paper together. And the stands here on the back, the supports, will actually raise up, and I can create an angle. And this is now sitting at an angle. So this is the easel sitting on the desk. You can just barely see the angle that it's sitting on the desk. It's actually raised up at about a 45-degree angle. I will take my board. It's going to go a little bit off the camera, but this is basically how I do my initial layout. Because now it's raised up a little bit, it's easier for me to be able to work on my composition, to be able to see everything in the proper scale and draw everything in the proper scale. So here I have my Samsung Galaxy Tab 10 FE tablet. I've done videos with this where this was the basically the medium I was using to draw something, where I was using IBIS Paint X on this particular tablet to work on one or more different illustrations in the past. But I also like using it as a very convenient monitor for any references that I'm using. It's a very nice size. I can easily have it sit beside me on my desk while I'm doing my initial composition, while I'm doing any other parts of the illustration. So it is loaded up with a bunch of photo shoots I've done over the years. In this instance, I have a photo of my friend Erin. I have a photo of her in this basement area holding onto a sword. And I want to use that as the basis for the sketch that I'm going to be doing, which will then grow into doing a full ink illustration. But typically when I'm doing my initial composition, if I'm not sketching out the idea on a different piece of paper and then transferring it over here, I will have this tablet sitting beside me, open, displaying any and all of the references if I'm toggling through different references. But in this instance, I want to concentrate mostly on this particular piece. And so you can see that I have the tablet set up on a stand sitting right beside the easel that I'm using so that I can easily reference it the whole time that I'm working. It's also sitting at roughly the same angle as the surface of the paper that I'm working on. And I'm going to grab a 2H pencil. This is a 2H Staedtler pencil. It's sitting in a pencil holder, so it means that even though this one's gotten fairly small, it's still usable for a while yet. And now I can start working on that layout using the 2H pencil. Now, typically, I don't show much of this portion of the illustration, whether it's going to be a full pencil illustration or if I'm going to be doing it as an ink piece, because the 2H pencil doesn't tend to show up on the camera very well. But I want to put her a little bit lower in the frame, as though what I was drawing was actually going to be the cover for a magazine. And when you're doing an illustration where that's going to be the cover for a magazine or a book cover or something like that, in general, the top 1/3 of the illustration needs to be less critical information than in the lower 2/3. You want the most important, the most interesting, the most story based portions of your illustration to be in the lower 2/3, because typically there will be some sort of logo, some sort of text over the top third. Because she's going to be the main focus of this illustration, during the composition phase, I'm going to be focusing on her. I'm going to start by drawing her character and then build everything else out from that, which is different than when I go to any sort of painting or final inking steps where I tend to work from back to front. I tend to leave the primary focus of the illustration for the last step. But I want to do her as the first step right now. I just want to do a very light outline of her. And mostly as an overall construction. Like I want to draw the various components that make her that make up the character. So typically, I always start with the head, figure out the basic direction of the eyes, the placement of the eyes, and the direction, and thereby the direction the head is facing. I'm going to build out from there. I'm drawing through the character to figure out where all the elements are in space. I'm wanting the center of the figure to be around here. So I want to end up making her head a little bit bigger than I have it right now. Now I'm using my reference as a guide. I want to add a little bit more movement into her limbs, into her body language. I'm not concerned about it making this a portrait of the character. Keeping an eye on proportions. In the reference, she's leaning very slightly. It's clear that much of her mass is moved over and supported by, from her point of view, her left leg. I kind of want to emphasize that a little bit more. Now, even though I'm using a photo reference because I know I want to move the character around a little bit, I still need to understand anatomy. I still need to understand how human figures are constructed so that I can change the body language. I can change the overall feel of how the character looks in space by knowing how everything is supposed to be working. Whereas if I was wanting to do this strictly as a portrait of the character, of the model, I might be more tempted to lay down grid lines to make it a little bit easier to match exactly the placement of the limbs in space. All right, so now that I have the penciling completed, everything's been laid down. I added in various extra elements, the pieces of robots everywhere, a figure coming around this open door, some graffiti on the door itself, and a bit of damage on those brick walls to indicate that, yeah, there was definitely some sort of fight going on here. I want to move on to the inking stage, and I'd like to talk specifically about the inking tools I'm using and, more importantly, how I'm using them. So here I'm using my crowquill nib pen. I really like how thin you get. You can make lines with this pen, but being a crowquill style pen, when you push down on it, it will vary the line width. It adds a lot more character to the lines than if you're using various types of brush pens. For instance, some of the type of pit pens that are out there, there is a brush pen that will flex as you're working on it, but most of them only have a particular width and they don't vary from that width, which is fine for a lot of types of illustration. What I'm wanting to do is using a bit more character than that, and I find that using a crowquill like this gives me a lot of control with, first off, starting out with how thin a line you can create, but then being able to make it quite a bit wider as you're working on it. Very similar to working with a brush, but with this I have a bit more control. I don't have quite as much control when I'm using a brush. Now, the tricky part about using the crowquill is that when you dip it into the ink, what I always find is that ink will dry so fast on the nib of the pen itself, so that very quickly it can actually gum up and not work properly. Then you have to clean the brush, clean the pen. Uh, and was finding it very frustrating when I was getting back into inking a few years ago. And I would limit myself to using a much larger speedball nib, more of a calligraphy pen, which didn't have the problem with getting all gummed up and getting dried out while you're using it, but it wasn't giving me lines as thin as I wanted. I would have to alternate between that and pit pens on a more regular basis. But as I kept playing with it, I rediscovered an old technique that I'd used, and I'm sure there are other techniques out there for using crowquill pens and to prevent having issues. Probably thinning out the ink a little bit would help out. But this is the method that tends to work for me the most. And it is fundamentally thinning out the ink every single time that I use it. So when I want to begin doing any inking lines, I'll actually dip the nib of my pen into the water that I normally have around for cleaning the brush, and then dip it into my speedball ink and start working. I'm just using it on this scratch pad here that I like to have just to make sure the pen's working properly. And I find that extra drop of water prevents the pen from clogging up and drying out while I'm working on it. And then when I want to reload the pen, I dip it into the water, then directly into the ink, and everything works great. I love the variation in line width I get using this, but it also makes a very, very tiny line, which works nicely with the style of work that I want to do. So as discussed, I first dip my crowquill pen into water and then into the Speedball super black ink that I'm using. And I'm actually going to start with this robot that's hanging from an overhead pipe up here. All right, now that I have the rest of the background completed, laying out the basic pattern of light and shadow, I'm going to start working on the central character. Chiefly when I'm working on the main character, I'll start with the face and then work out from there. And I'll start with the face. Usually I start with the eyes, but because I have this strand of hair going over the face, I want to make sure I capture that first. I'm thinking the character, she's clearly cybernetic in nature to be able to deal with the various destroyed robots in the vicinity. So, but I don't want to give her too much in the way of obvious cybernetics. I want to make it a little bit more subtle. So in this case, I'm just going to go initially with white on white eyes. Give her the sense that she has metallic or metal eyes. I can still consulting my reference photo just to the side here. with all the detail in the background. I'm going to use that detail as contrast to the main character, where I'm going to keep the level of detail on the character to a minimum. That will help her jump out of the frame a little bit more. All that detail in the environment will push focus. It'll draw the viewer's eye towards her. Even a relatively simple pose like this on the main character still has storytelling elements. The fact that she's somewhat in a meditative pose in this setting is indicating that something just happened. And to reinforce that, the character coming around the door over here, reacting to all of this, is adding to that storytelling. Now, the fact that this crowquill pen allows me, as a vary how much pressure I'm putting on it as I'm drawing, will vary the line width, make some parts thicker and some parts thinner as I'm drawing. That gives a little bit more energy to the character. Adds a little bit more life. And every time I go back to reload my pen, I first dip the pen in water and then dip it into the ink. One of the nice things about working with a model, instead of just working entirely from imagination, is there's some things that the model will do that I wouldn't have thought of. Like with her left hand, she actually extended her pinky finger directly out while the rest of her fingers were wrapping around the top of this sword, and I would not have thought of drawing it that way. But I like that idea, so I'm leaving that in. Just an interesting little bit of business and characterization. Now you see one technique I'm doing with the main character here is that the background line art does not actually touch the main character until we get to something where, to a spot where she is interacting directly with the background. Like this other illustration, this recent piece that I did, this hunter piece that I got up on the screen, where the deeper background is just sort of haloing around her, but where she's interacting directly with the environment, with the surface of the coffin and such in front of her, then the line art of that coffin intersects with her. But it's just something else to further heighten the focus on the main character and making it about her, about that particular storytelling. So I'm doing a similar thing with this, where the brickwork behind her, where she's not directly touching the brick, doesn't actually touch her. But then when I move down to where her boots end up directly on the ground, then the background line art will be intersecting with her. So even here with the sword, now that I have the sword touching the ground, I'll start adding some line art from the ground to interact with it. Now, quite often I use a lot of reflective surfaces on the ground in the cyberpunk pieces if it's a rainy street or something. But in this instance it isn't. So I'm not going to make the sword reflect, but I will add some additional shadows later once I put in the boots intersecting with the ground. Now you can see with the bottom of this boot, because the boot is intersecting directly into the background, I will have the line art of the background come right up to it. Now, there are some old school comic book inkers that would be inking entirely with a brush. There used to be a school of thought that thought where they thought using a crowquill was cheating. I do not have a steady enough hand to do the entire inked piece with just a brush, especially the fine detail. Although if you can do that, it actually does speed up your time spent inking. Now, I know that today, in this age of digital inking, all the techniques I'm using here would themselves be seen as more old school. And I've certainly done a lot of digital inking using these techniques with a stylus instead of with a pen or a brush. And I do like doing those. But ultimately, however, my favorite method of inking is sitting here on a smooth paper surface using a combination of the crowquill pen and a brush. Do I consider one to be more valid than the other? Not really. It just depends on what your purpose is. In a lot of cases, it just comes down to personal preference. And with all that, here is the final completed version. This is after it's been scanned in at high resolution. So in this video, we discussed the basic procedures from initial pencil concept to finished ink illustration, everything I use with regard to my various tools, elevating and changing the angle of the illustration when I do the initial pencil layout, and then leaving it flat when I do all of the ink work, working with the crowquill pen, including adding water essentially to the ink to make sure that the ink is flowing properly on that crowquill pen, and then alternating between that and using a brush. Thank you very much for hanging out with me as I work on this piece, and hopefully I will see you in the next video.